the years following the Second World War, the United States did not simply emerge victorious, it emerged responsible. Europe lay in ruins, old empires were collapsing, and a new global struggle was taking shape, one defined not by front lines and trenches, but by ideology, influence, and fear. The Soviet Union, once an ally of convenience, now stood as a rival power with a radically different vision for the future. Between these two giants stretched a fragile world, searching for stability while standing on the edge of permanent confrontation. For American leaders, the lessons of the 1930s were still painfully fresh. Isolation had not prevented catastrophe, delayed action had not preserved peace, and the cost of underestimating hostile regimes had been counted in millions of lives. By the late 1940s, Washington's strategic thinking was shaped by a single guiding belief. Allowing aggressive ideologies to spread unchecked would only make the eventual conflict larger, deadlier, and impossible to contain. This belief gave rise to containment, a policy not of conquest, but of prevention. The goal was not to dominate the world, but to stop it from falling into chaos. From the Marshall Plan to NATO, the United States positioned itself as the anchor of a fragile post-war order, investing enormous resources to stabilize regions that had been shattered by war. But even as Europe slowly rebuilt, another front was forming much closer to home. Latin America had long occupied a unique place in American strategic thinking. The Monroe Doctrine, declared more than a century earlier, was not merely historical rhetoric. It was a warning, rooted in geography and survival. Any hostile power gaining a military foothold in the Western Hemisphere posed a direct threat to the United States itself. During World War II, this concern had been largely theoretical. In the Cold War, it became dangerously real. Cuba, an island just 90 miles from Florida, had for decades existed within America's economic and strategic orbit. It was not a perfect relationship, but it was a predictable one. That balance shattered in 1959 when Fidel Castro and his revolutionary movement overthrew the Batista regime. At first, American officials watched cautiously, unsure of Castro's true intentions. Revolutionary movements were not automatically communist, and Washington hoped that Cuba might chart an independent path. Those hopes faded quickly. Castro moved to consolidate power, dismantling opposition and nationalizing industries, many of them American-owned. His rhetoric hardened, his alliances shifted. As relations with Washington deteriorated, Havana turned increasingly toward Moscow. For the Soviet Union, the opportunity was obvious. A revolutionary government openly hostile to the United States, located within striking distance of American cities, was a geopolitical gift of historic proportions. From Washington's perspective, this was not about ideology alone. It was about proximity. A hostile regime in Eastern Europe was one thing. A hostile regime in the Caribbean was something else entirely. The Cold War had suddenly arrived at America's doorstep. Inside the White House and the Pentagon, concern grew steadily. Intelligence reports painted a troubling picture of Soviet advisors arriving in Cuba, military equipment flowing into the island, and Cuban forces being reorganized along Eastern Bloc lines. The fear was not that Cuba would invade the United States, but that it would become a permanent forward operating base for Soviet power in the Western Hemisphere. This fear intensified after the experience of Korea. There, a regional conflict had escalated into a full-scale war involving superpowers, costing tens of thousands of American lives. The lesson was clear. Local crises could spiral rapidly if not addressed early. Allowing Cuba to fully align with the Soviet Union risked repeating that mistake, this time far closer to home. American leaders faced a narrowing set of options. Direct military invasion risked international outrage and escalation with the Soviet Union. Doing nothing risked normalizing a communist stronghold in the Caribbean. Between those extremes lay covert action, diplomacy, and pressure, each carrying its own dangers and uncertainties. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, himself a veteran of global war, understood the stakes intimately. He authorized intelligence agencies to explore ways of weakening Castro's hold on power without triggering open conflict. These efforts were not driven by recklessness, but by caution. The objective was to prevent a far larger war by acting quietly, early, and decisively. When John F. Kennedy entered the White House in 1961, he inherited this unfinished problem. Young, intelligent, and acutely aware of how history judged presidential decisions, Kennedy faced immediate pressure. The Soviet Union was testing nuclear weapons. The Berlin question loomed unresolved. And now Cuba, once a peripheral concern, had become a symbol of whether the United States could defend its sphere of influence without plunging the world into nuclear war. Kennedy's advisors were divided. Some urged strength, warning that hesitation would embolden adversaries everywhere. Others counseled restraint, reminding the president that a single miscalculation could unleash consequences beyond anyone's control. At the center of it all stood the United States, attempting to balance power with prudence, resolve with responsibility. What followed would not be a single decision, but a chain of choices, each shaped by fear, intelligence gaps, political pressure, and the shadow of nuclear annihilation. Before missiles were discovered, before naval blockades, before the world held its breath in October 1962, the United States was already engaged in a silent struggle to prevent Cuba from becoming something far more dangerous than a revolutionary island. This is the story of how that struggle began, not with war, but with warnings, not with bombs, but with intelligence, and not with certainty, but with leaders forced to act in a world where waiting could be just as deadly as striking first. The early 1960s, Cuba was no longer just a revolutionary experiment unfolding on a Caribbean island. It had become a strategic variable capable of altering the global balance of power. What made the situation uniquely dangerous was not simply Fidel Castro's alignment with the Soviet Union, but the speed at which Cuba was being transformed into a militarized outpost in the Cold War. American intelligence agencies began noticing patterns that could no longer be dismissed as routine cooperation. Soviet ships were arriving in Cuban ports with unusual frequency. Cargo manifests were vague. Military advisors, officially described as technicians, appeared in growing numbers across the island. Training camps expanded. Airfields were upgraded. Radar installations began to appear in places where none had existed before. None of this, on its own, proved hostile intent, but together, the pieces formed a picture that deeply unsettled Washington. The Central Intelligence Agency, still recovering from intelligence failures earlier in the Cold War, faced immense pressure to deliver clarity. Analysts debated endlessly. Was Cuba merely seeking defensive capabilities, fearing a US-backed invasion? Or was it becoming something far more ambitious, a forward base for Soviet power projection in the Western Hemisphere? President Kennedy demanded answers, but the answers were incomplete by nature. Intelligence is rarely definitive. It is a world of probabilities, assumptions, and worst-case scenarios. And in the nuclear age, worst-case scenarios carried existential weight. Inside the Pentagon, planners examined maps that suddenly looked very different. Missiles stationed in Eastern Europe had flight times measured in hours. Missiles launched from Cuba would reach American cities in minutes. Decision windows would shrink. Warning systems would be strained. The margin for error would evaporate. For military strategists, this was unacceptable. At the same time, the memory of the failed Bay of Pigs invasion still lingered heavily over the Kennedy administration. Intended as a covert effort to destabilize Castro's regime using Cuban exiles, the operation had ended in embarrassment and global scrutiny. It taught a brutal lesson. Half measures could be more dangerous than bold ones, and secrecy could collapse under the weight of reality. Castro, for his part, interpreted the invasion as confirmation of his worst fears. He believed the United States would never tolerate his government, regardless of its actions. From his perspective, aligning fully with the Soviet Union was not provocation, but survival. Soviet protection became his shield.
Nikita Khrushchev saw the situation differently. To him, Cuba was leverage. The United States had stationed nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy close to Soviet borders. The strategic imbalance was obvious. By placing missiles in Cuba, the Soviet Union could restore parity, force negotiations, and demonstrate that American dominance was not absolute. Yet even within the Soviet leadership, the plan was controversial. It carried enormous risks. Discovery could humiliate Moscow or trigger a confrontation neither side truly wanted. Still, Khrushchev believed the Americans would hesitate. He believed Kennedy, young and politically vulnerable, would avoid escalation at almost any cost. This belief shaped everything that followed. As 1962 progressed, reconnaissance flights over Cuba increased. U-2 spy planes, flying at extreme altitudes, captured images that analysts pored over frame by frame. Initially, nothing definitive appeared. Surface-to-air missile sites were detected, a troubling development, but still within the realm of defensive systems. Then came the anomalies. Construction patterns didn't match standard air defense installations. Launch pads were too large. Support buildings were too complex. Roads were being reinforced to handle heavy equipment. Fuel storage sites appeared where none should have existed. The puzzle pieces began locking into place. When the photographic evidence finally reached the highest levels of government, there was no room for interpretation. Medium-range ballistic missiles were being installed on Cuban soil. For Kennedy and his advisors, the discovery triggered a crisis unlike any before. This was not a theoretical threat or an intelligence estimate. It was a physical reality unfolding in real time. Missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads were being prepared less than 100 miles from American shores. The room where decisions were made grew quiet, not because no one had ideas, but because everyone understood what was at stake.
Immediate airstrikes could eliminate the missiles, but they would almost certainly kill Soviet personnel, forcing Moscow to respond. A full-scale invasion could remove Castro, but at the cost of war, occupation, and potentially Soviet retaliation elsewhere. Doing nothing would signal weakness and permanently alter the strategic landscape. Kennedy formed the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, known as EXCOM, bringing together military leaders, diplomats, intelligence officials, and political advisors. For days, arguments clashed behind closed doors. Hawks demanded decisive action. Doves warned of catastrophic escalation. Every option carried consequences that could not be reversed. Meanwhile, the American public knew nothing. Cities continued their routines, children went to school. Newspapers reported on ordinary politics. Beneath the surface, however, the world had entered its most dangerous moment since the end of World War II. A single misstep, a misunderstood signal, or an overconfident assumption could ignite a nuclear exchange that no one could control. Kennedy understood something crucial. Strength alone would not resolve this crisis, nor would fear. The United States needed to project resolve without cornering its adversary, to apply pressure without triggering panic. It was a delicate balance, one that history rarely affords leaders under such conditions. As Soviet ships continued moving toward Cuba and missile sites neared operational readiness, time became the enemy. Every hour that passed reduced American options. The window for preventing a permanent strategic shift was closing rapidly. What followed would test not only military power, but judgment, restraint, and the ability to see beyond immediate victory. The decisions made next would not just define Kennedy's presidency. They would determine whether the Cold War remained cold or exploded into something far worse. And the world was about to find out just how close it had come to the edge. When President Kennedy finally addressed the nation on October 22, 1962, the world changed in a matter of minutes. His calm, deliberate tone concealed the magnitude of what he was announcing. The United States had discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, and it would not accept their presence. Rather than ordering immediate military action, Kennedy chose a path that surprised even his closest advisors.
He announced a naval quarantine around Cuba, a carefully chosen term meant to avoid the legal and political implications of declaring a blockade, which would have been considered an act of war. This decision reflected a strategic mindset shaped by restraint, not weakness. The goal was clear: stop additional offensive weapons from reaching the island while giving Moscow time to reconsider its course. It was pressure without provocation, firmness without recklessness.
American warships moved into position across the Atlantic. Destroyers, cruisers, and aircraft carriers formed a tightening arc around Cuba. Submarines prowled beneath the surface. Strategic Air Command raised its alert level. Nuclear bombers sat on runways, engines ready, crews on standby, operating under protocols designed for a world-ending scenario. Behind the scenes, XCOM continued to meet almost constantly. Discussions grew more intense as Soviet ships approached the quarantine line. Every radar contact carried significance. Would they turn back? Would they attempt to force their way through? Would a single confrontation spiral beyond control? Kennedy's greatest fear was not deliberate war, but accidental war. A nervous commander, a misunderstood order, a radar glitch. Any of these could trigger a chain reaction no one intended. For this reason, strict rules of engagement were enforced. American commanders were instructed to avoid escalation unless absolutely necessary. The Soviet response was measured but ambiguous. Publicly, Khrushchev denounced the quarantine as aggression. Privately, he hesitated. Soviet ships slowed, some altered course, others continued forward, testing American resolve. Then came the moment that could have shattered everything. On October 24, several Soviet vessels nearing the quarantine line either stopped or turned back. The immediate crisis eased, but the core problem remained unresolved. The missiles already in Cuba were still there, still being prepared, still capable of changing the strategic balance. Intelligence reports confirmed that some launch sites were nearing operational status. Time was slipping away again. Meanwhile, Fidel Castro watched events unfold with growing anxiety. He had not been consulted on the placement of nuclear missiles, yet his country would be the first target if war erupted. Castro urged Khrushchev to stand firm, warning that any sign of retreat would invite future American intervention. Inside Washington, pressure mounted from military leaders who believed the quarantine alone would not be enough. Airstrikes could eliminate the missile sites. An invasion could remove Castro permanently. Every delay increased risk. Kennedy listened, but he did not rush. Instead, he pursued multiple channels simultaneously. Diplomatic messages flowed through official and unofficial routes. Back-channel communications, including those involving the Soviet ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin, sought a way out that preserved dignity on both sides. Then Khrushchev sent a letter. It was emotional, personal, almost desperate in tone. He proposed a deal. The Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade the island. The message revealed strain within the Soviet leadership and hinted at a desire to de-escalate. Before Kennedy could respond, a second letter arrived, harsher and more formal. This time, Khrushchev demanded not only a non-invasion pledge, but also the removal of American Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The situation grew dangerously complex. Which letter represented the true Soviet position? Responding incorrectly could undo everything. At the same time, events on the ground threatened to outrun diplomacy. A U-2 reconnaissance plane was shot down over Cuba, killing Major Rudolph Anderson, the first American casualty of the crisis. Military leaders urged immediate retaliation. Kennedy refused. This decision, perhaps more than any other, demonstrated the core principle guiding American actions during the crisis. The United States would defend its security interests, but it would not allow emotion or pride to dictate decisions that could lead to nuclear war. Instead, Kennedy crafted a careful response. Publicly, he replied only to the first letter, agreeing to a non-invasion pledge. Privately, through secret channels, he conveyed willingness to remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey at a later date,
provided the Soviet withdrawal from Cuba was verifiable and complete. It was a gamble built on trust, secrecy, and timing. As messages crossed oceans and hours felt like days, the world hovered on the brink. American cities prepared for the unthinkable. Soviet forces remained on alert. Cuban defenses stood ready, unsure whether they were about to become ground zero of a global catastrophe. The outcome now depended on one final decision in Moscow. Would Khrushchev accept the compromise, or would history take a darker turn? The answer would arrive soon, and when it did, it would confirm just how narrowly humanity had avoided the edge of annihilation. On the morning of October 28, 1962, the world awoke without knowing whether it would survive the day. Inside the Kremlin, Nikita Khrushchev faced a decision unlike any leader before him. Across the Atlantic, the United States remained at DEFCON 2, the highest nuclear alert level in American history, short of war itself. American B-52 bombers were airborne around the clock, some carrying live nuclear weapons. Missile crews sat underground, fingers near launch switches, awaiting orders that everyone prayed would never come. In the Atlantic, U.S. Navy ships maintained their quarantine positions, tracking Soviet submarines whose exact locations remained uncertain. One of those submarines, later identified as B-59, had already come terrifyingly close to disaster. Harassed by American destroyers dropping practice depth charges, the Soviet submarine lost contact with Moscow. Its crew, exhausted, overheated, and unaware of diplomatic progress, believed war might have already begun. Unknown to the Americans above, the submarine carried a nuclear-tipped torpedo. Only the refusal of one officer, Vasily Arkhipov, to authorize its launch prevented an irreversible escalation. This moment, invisible to the public at the time, would later be recognized as one of the closest brushes with nuclear war in human history. Back in Washington, President Kennedy remained isolated in the White House, reviewing intelligence updates and awaiting confirmation from Moscow. His leadership during these hours reflected a deliberate effort to balance resolve with restraint. Military options remained on the table, but they were no longer the preferred path. Kennedy understood something many did not. Victory in this crisis would not come from destroying Cuba or humiliating the Soviet Union. It would come from preventing catastrophe while preserving long-term stability. Shortly after noon, word arrived. Radio Moscow broadcast Khrushchev's message to the world. The Soviet leader announced that the missiles in Cuba would be dismantled and removed under United Nations supervision. In return, the United States would pledge not to invade Cuba. The immediate danger had passed. Relief swept through Washington, but it was tempered with caution. Verification mattered. American reconnaissance flights continued. Intelligence analysts monitored every movement at missile sites. The removal process would take weeks, and any deviation could reignite the crisis. Publicly, Kennedy presented the outcome as a firm but peaceful defense of American security. Privately, he ordered that the agreement regarding the Jupiter missiles in Turkey remain secret. Their removal would occur months later, quietly, without fanfare. This secrecy was intentional. Kennedy understood the importance of alliance unity and domestic confidence. The outcome needed to appear as a strategic success, not a concession under pressure. For the United States, the crisis marked a turning point in Cold War strategy. It reinforced the importance of intelligence, measured response, and direct communication between nuclear powers. Within months, the White House and the Kremlin established a direct hotline to prevent future misunderstandings. In Cuba, the outcome was more complex. Fidel Castro felt sidelined and betrayed by Moscow's decision. Cuba remained under American embargo, isolated and militarized. Yet the non-invasion pledge effectively secured Castro's regime, ensuring its survival for decades. For American military planners, the crisis exposed vulnerabilities and strengths alike. The value of naval power, air superiority, and strategic deterrence was reaffirmed. At the same time, the danger of miscalculation became undeniable. Kennedy himself emerged changed. Those close to him noted a deepened seriousness after the crisis. He spoke less casually about military force. He emphasized diplomacy, arms control, and the shared responsibility of leadership in a nuclear age. The Cuban Missile Crisis had ended without a shot being fired between superpowers, but its lessons were written in invisible ink, understood fully only by those who had lived through the 13 days. It proved that strength was not measured by how quickly a nation went to war, but by how carefully it avoided one. And yet, beneath the relief, a sobering truth remained. The systems that had brought the world to the brink still existed. The weapons were still there. The ideologies still clashed. The crisis had not ended the Cold War. It had merely revealed how close humanity could come to ending itself. And for the United States, that realization would shape military doctrine, foreign policy, and presidential decision-making for generations to come. When the immediate tension of the Cuban Missile Crisis finally subsided, there was no celebration inside the corridors of power in Washington. What remained was something far heavier, a full awareness that the United States had come closer to nuclear war than at any other moment in its history. Behind closed doors, senior American officials began a brutal reassessment of everything they thought they understood about deterrence, intelligence, and control. The conclusions were deeply unsettling. U.S. intelligence had failed to detect the full scope of Soviet deployments in Cuba. Not only were medium-range nuclear missiles already operational, but thousands of Soviet troops were stationed on the island, many equipped with tactical nuclear weapons that American planners had not known existed.
Even more alarming was the revelation that local Soviet commanders possessed conditional authority to use those weapons if an invasion occurred. This single fact reshaped American military thinking overnight. Had U.S. Marines landed on Cuban beaches, nuclear weapons could have detonated against American forces without any direct order from Moscow. The invasion plans that had been carefully prepared during the crisis were, in hindsight, a blueprint for catastrophe. The Pentagon responded with urgency. A sweeping internal review was launched across all branches of the armed forces. War plans were rewritten. Nuclear command and control procedures were tightened to unprecedented levels. Authorization chains were clarified, layered, and reinforced to prevent accidental or unauthorized use under any circumstances. The United States had learned a hard truth. Military superiority meant little without absolute control. Strategically, the crisis forced American leaders to redefine what victory meant in the nuclear age. There had been no battlefield triumph, no surrender, no parade. Yet the strategic outcome was undeniable. Soviet nuclear weapons were removed from the Western Hemisphere, and the balance of power had been preserved without a single shot being fired. This was a new kind of success. From this point forward, American strategy increasingly emphasized crisis management rather than battlefield dominance alone. Deterrence was no longer about threatening annihilation, but about preventing situations where annihilation became possible. One of the most important institutional changes emerged quietly but decisively. The establishment of direct communication between Washington and Moscow, later known as the Hotline, was not a diplomatic gesture. It was a survival mechanism.
During the crisis, messages between the White House and the Kremlin had taken hours, sometimes longer, traveling through diplomatic channels that were slow and vulnerable to misinterpretation. American planners concluded that in a nuclear standoff, minutes could mean the difference between restraint and extinction. Direct communication became mandatory. At the same time, the United States accelerated investments in intelligence capabilities. Satellite reconnaissance programs expanded rapidly. Signals intelligence was prioritized. The goal was absolute clarity. Never again would nuclear weapons be deployed so close to American territory without immediate detection. The crisis also transformed the role of the presidency. John F. Kennedy's handling of the confrontation became a defining case study in American leadership. His refusal to accept a single military recommendation, his insistence on hearing dissenting opinions, and his willingness to leave room for the adversary to step back without humiliation fundamentally altered how future presidents approached national security decisions. Military academies would later study those 13 days, not as a lesson in aggression, but in restraint. Inside the armed forces, training evolved accordingly. Naval officers analyzed the quarantine in detail, studying how U.S. warships had applied pressure while avoiding actions that could provoke Soviet retaliation. Air Force planners re-examined reconnaissance protocols, recognizing how close U-2 flights had come to triggering open conflict. Rules of engagement became more precise. Escalation thresholds were defined with unprecedented care. The crisis also reshaped America's relationship with its allies. NATO partners, many of whom had not been fully informed during the standoff, demanded clearer coordination. The United States responded by strengthening alliance consultation mechanisms, ensuring that future nuclear crises would not unfold in isolation. Meanwhile, Cuba itself became a permanent focal point of American strategic attention. Although the missiles were removed, the island remained heavily militarized. U.S. surveillance flights continued, naval patrols remained active, intelligence monitoring intensified. From Washington's perspective, the crisis had not ended the threat, only stabilized it. The embargo against Cuba hardened into long-term policy, not merely as punishment, but as containment. Preventing the island from becoming a renewed Soviet forward base became a standing objective of U.S. strategy in the Western Hemisphere. Publicly, the American people were reassured. Kennedy addressed the nation with confidence and calm.
The message was clear. The United States had stood firm, defended its security, and avoided war. But behind the scenes, those who had lived through the crisis carried its weight for the rest of their lives. Senior officials later admitted that many of their assumptions about control, predictability, and rational decision-making had been permanently shattered. The Cold War did not end after Cuba. Arms races accelerated. Proxy wars continued across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Yet beneath the surface, something fundamental had changed. A shared understanding emerged between superpowers that nuclear war was not a tool of policy, but a failure of it. For the United States, this realization became a quiet advantage. American power would now be measured not only by its ability to fight wars, but by its ability to prevent them. Strength remained essential, but judgment became paramount.
The Cuban Missile Crisis had forced the United States to mature strategically in ways no battlefield victory ever could. It taught American leaders that survival in the nuclear age depended not on boldness alone, but on discipline, restraint, and an unwavering commitment to control. That understanding, forged in restraint rather than victory, became the invisible framework guiding American security strategy throughout the remainder of the Cold War and beyond. By the time the Cuban Missile Crisis faded from newspaper headlines, many Americans believed the danger had passed. The missiles were gone, the ships had turned back, the world had not ended. To the casual observer, it seemed like a momentary brush with catastrophe, narrowly avoided through calm leadership and good fortune. But inside the halls of Washington, the opposite conclusion was taking shape. What had occurred in October 1962 was not a temporary crisis, it was a permanent revelation. For the first time, the United States had confronted a reality that could not be reversed. Total war between superpowers no longer meant victory, it meant extinction. No industrial base, no carrier fleet, no nuclear stockpile could guarantee survival once escalation crossed a certain threshold. And that realization quietly rewired American strategic thinking from the ground up. In the years that followed, every major U.S. security decision carried the shadow of Cuba.
Military planners no longer asked only how to win wars, they asked how to prevent them from starting. Deterrence became doctrine. Restraint became strength. Silence became as important as firepower. The Pentagon expanded early warning systems not to enable attack, but to avoid miscalculation. Hotlines were established between Washington and Moscow, so misunderstandings could be resolved in minutes rather than missiles. Nuclear strategy shifted away from battlefield use towards second strike survivability, ensuring that no adversary could ever believe a first blow would go unanswered. Even covert operations changed. Where once secrecy had been used to destabilize enemies aggressively, it was now applied with greater caution, measured against the risk of unintended escalation. The lesson was brutal and simple. Power without control was no longer power at all. Cuba itself remained a living reminder of that truth.
Just 90 miles from Florida, a hostile communist state endured, not because it was strong, but because removing it carried risks no president was willing to accept. Fidel Castro stayed in power for decades, not as a sign of American weakness, but as evidence of American restraint, shaped by hard-earned wisdom. For the United States, the Cold War that followed was defined less by direct confrontation and more by balance. Proxy wars were fought, influence was contested, intelligence battles replaced open conflict between superpowers. And through it all, the memory of those 13 days in October lingered like an unspoken rule etched into every strategic calculation. Future presidents would face crises of their own: Berlin, Vietnam, the Middle East, nuclear standoffs in Europe and Asia. Each time, advisors would invoke the same silent question: could this spiral into something we cannot stop? And more often than not, that question alone was enough to slow the machinery of war. In hindsight, the Cuban Missile Crisis was not America's closest call. It was its most important lesson. Not because missiles were removed, but because illusions were destroyed. The illusion that wars between great powers could still be controlled. The illusion that strength alone ensured safety. The illusion that victory was guaranteed by dominance. What emerged in its place was something quieter, heavier, and far more enduring: a strategic maturity forged under the shadow of annihilation. That legacy did not announce itself with parades or treaties. It embedded itself invisibly into doctrine, diplomacy, and decision-making. It shaped how America wielded power, how it measured risk, and how it understood responsibility in a nuclear world. And long after the Cold War ended, after flags changed and enemies shifted, that lesson remained. Because once a nation looks directly at the edge of its own destruction and chooses restraint over triumph, it does not forget what it saw. History remembers battles, but it is moments like this, unseen, restrained, irreversible, that define eras. And in that sense, America's most consequential victory over Cuba was not won through invasion, overthrow, or force. It was won by stepping back and ensuring the world lived to see another day.